There comes a moment, often quiet, almost imperceptible, when a parent, now retired, sits alone at the edge of the bed and realizes the phone hasn't rung. Not today, not yesterday, and perhaps not the day before either. That silence, more than any aching joint or fading memory, whispers a truth few dare to name. You have given everything, but now no one seems to need you anymore. The nest is empty. The calendar, once filled with birthdays and visits, now holds only medical appointments and grocery lists. But Freud would have told you, this mourning is not just for your children, it is for your own forgotten self. Have you ever wondered when it happened? The exact moment you stopped being a person and became only a role: mom, dad, provider, advisor, helper, always giving, always present. In Freud's language, the ego, once robust and exploratory, has been shackled by decades of duty. You built your identity around their needs, their crises, their victories, but now that you've stepped away from work, from structure, from relevance, who are you without them? And more importantly, do you dare to find out? This is not about blame, nor is it about forgetting your children. It's about reclaiming the fragments of yourself left behind during the long marathon of parenting. Freud taught us that unresolved attachments can anchor the psyche in a perpetual loop of suffering. Many retirees fall into the trap of emotional overinvestment, unconsciously expecting their grown children to validate a lifetime of sacrifice. But when that validation doesn't come, in the form of visits, gratitude, or attention, a quiet grief takes root. And that grief, when left unexamined, becomes bitterness masked as concern. So let me ask you, not as a stranger, but as someone who respects your story deeply, are you still trying to parent the adult children who have already set sail? Are you tying your worth to how often they call, how much they share, or whether they still need your advice? If so, perhaps it's time for something braver, something few ever attempt. Perhaps it's time to redirect that love inward, not with guilt, but with reverence. Not to abandon your children, but to liberate yourself from the illusion that their well-being is your responsibility forever. Because here lies the quiet paradox Freud so elegantly unraveled. Sometimes the greatest act of love is detachment, not coldness, not absence, but the decision to let go of what no longer feeds your soul. Retirement is not an end, it is a rebirth. And maybe, just maybe, this chapter is not about being needed by others, but about needing yourself enough to finally become who you were meant to be. On the first morning of retirement, many parents wake up to a strange and unsettling realization. They no longer know who they are. The absence of alarm clocks, responsibilities, and urgent errands is replaced by a haunting silence, what Freud might call the echo of the superego, a void left behind when identity collapses and the self is left without reflection. For decades, their sense of worth has been entangled with usefulness, presence, and unconditional availability to their children. Now, stripped of those anchors, they face unfamiliar territory, their own interior life. But how does one recognize oneself when no longer needed? Freud believed that much of human suffering stems not from what we lack, but from what we refuse to let go. Parenthood, when not fully processed and internalized, can become a compulsion to repeat, an unconscious drive to remain central in the lives of grown children, even when those lives have taken their own course. The retired father who calls every day, the mother offering unsolicited advice, the worry disguised as care. These are not acts of love, but symptoms of psychic resistance. They reveal an unspoken grief, not for the child who moved on, but for the role that has been rendered obsolete. This moment of rupture holds a rare opportunity to confront the truth that love does not mean control, and that to care does not mean to disappear. Freud warned that failure to mourn the end of a life phase leads to emotional stagnation. Many retired parents, instead of embracing their newfound freedom, unconsciously slip into melancholy, develop vague physical ailments, or spiral into sadness. It's as though the body begins to express what the unconscious mind refuses to acknowledge, that relevance was never meant to be permanent, and so, clinging to the past becomes a way to delay the pain of reinvention. We must learn that the bond with our children evolves, And this is not abandonment but maturity. Freud teaches that the evolution of love is measured by the ability to witness the autonomy of the other without collapsing. When a parent accepts that they are no longer central in the same way, a new kind of relationship emerges, one built less on dependence and more on mutual respect. Those who make peace with this shift live lighter lives. Those who resist it become prisoners of unspoken expectations, demanding gratitude that may never arrive. So before you dwell on what your children are or aren't doing for you, ask yourself a more essential question. What are you doing for yourself? This is a quintessential Freudian inquiry, redirecting energy from blame to introspection. It is not the other who must change. It is the self that must awaken. Retirement should not mark an end, but rather the beginning of a deeper self-exploration, a liberation from the unconscious chains of over-identification. When love ceases to be a neurotic need and becomes a conscious offering, only then is mature connection truly born. The need to feel indispensable is one of the most seductive traps of parenthood. It flatters the ego, reassures the psyche, and grants a sense of purpose that is difficult to surrender. Freud would interpret this as the ego's desperate attempt to maintain narcissistic supply, clinging to an external object, the child, to preserve internal coherence. But when children grow up and naturally detach, this mechanism collapses, and the parent is left to confront an internal void that had long been masked by self-sacrifice. The terror is not in being alone. It is in not knowing who you are without them. Many retirees find themselves over-involved in their children's lives not because they are needed, but because they do not know what else to do with their affection, their time, their identity. They mask control as concern and dependency as devotion. Freud called this displacement, redirecting internal conflict onto another object to avoid facing one's own psychic turmoil. And so, instead of examining their unfulfilled desires, their repressed longings, their latent fears, they project all of it onto their children's choices, relationships, or silences. But this kind of emotional entanglement, although common, is a form of psychic fusion that stunts the growth of both sides. It prevents the child from becoming fully autonomous and denies the parent the chance to individuate in their later years. Freud would argue that this failure to separate is a refusal to undergo a second individuation, a psychological process that is just as vital in old age as it is in adolescence. It is in this phase that the parent must symbolically die to the role they once held and be reborn as an independent being again. To stop worrying excessively about your children is not to become indifferent. It is to become whole. It is to trust that the seeds you planted have taken root and that your presence is no longer needed as a gardener, but perhaps now as a tree, grounded, silent, offering shade without intrusion. Freud saw in this transition the triumph of the ego over the unconscious need to repeat outdated patterns. It is the passage from compulsion to consciousness, from clinging to offering, from needing to knowing. So ask yourself, are you guiding or are you gripping? Are your words an offering or an attempt to anchor yourself to relevance? Behind every piece of unsolicited advice lies a fear of becoming invisible. But invisibility, when embraced, becomes transparency, a state where you are no longer defined by others' gaze, but by your own inner clarity. In that space, something remarkable happens. Your children begin to seek you not out of obligation, but out of admiration. When Freud explored the dynamics of family relationships, he often returned to the idea of unresolved conflict lingering beneath the surface of ordinary gestures. A question posed too many times, a visit too heavily suggested, a passive-aggressive silence. These are not simple acts of love or absence. They are often echoes of deeper, unspoken demands. The parent who can't stop worrying may believe they're protecting their child, but in truth, they may be shielding themselves from a confrontation with their own mortality, loneliness, or emotional dependence. Love, in this case, becomes a mask for fear. Retirement, paradoxically, brings a return to the self, but only if one is brave enough to look. Without the distractions of professional identity or constant parental tasks, the psychic noise begins to settle, and in that silence, long-buried questions arise. What have I sacrificed of myself in the name of devotion? What parts of my soul did I hand over while trying to build a better life for others? Freud would call this the return of the repressed, the resurgence of forgotten dreams, censored desires, and unexplored aspects of the self, now demanding recognition. The danger is in missing this call. Many choose to anesthetize themselves with overparenting, watching their children's every move, as if their own survival depended on it. And perhaps, on some unconscious level, it does. The Freudian psyche fears the vacuum. If not filled with responsibility or purpose, it will conjure up neuroses to avoid facing the terrifying question, what is left of me when I am no longer needed? But that question, difficult as it is, contains the key to liberation. Because if there is something left, some desire, some passion, some curiosity, then life still burns within. Freud believed that healing comes not from avoiding the truth, but from naming it. So let us name it. The over-concern with adult children is often a symptom of inner emptiness. It is not an accusation, but a revelation. It points not to weakness, but to an unfulfilled capacity. There is still more to live, more to feel, more to discover. But only when you stop defining yourself through the lens of someone else's journey. Only when you allow the gaze to return inward and begin the sacred work of late-life individuation, the reclaiming of your own narrative. And so, with tenderness and courage, you are invited to ask, who were you before they needed you? Beneath the role of caretaker, there was always a soul longing to create, to connect, to exist beyond function. That self still lives. And retirement is not the end of usefulness. It is the rediscovery of essence. The worry you've been projecting onto your children may be the very energy that could rebuild your relationship with yourself. The shift begins not with them, but with you. As we move deeper into this journey, we must confront one of the most painful truths in Freud's thought. Much of our suffering is self-imposed through unconscious repetition. You may think you're acting out of love, but what if you're reliving a pattern from your own childhood? The parent who now clings to grown children may, in fact, be replaying unresolved abandonment from their own past, trying to secure in old age what was never fully received in youth. Freud taught that the past never truly stays in the past. It disguises itself as concern, tradition, or duty, but its grip is unmistakable. This realization is not meant to evoke shame. It's meant to invite compassion. Imagine for a moment that every fear you carry about your children forgetting you is actually your inner child fearing to be forgotten. That every insistence on staying close is a cry for closeness you yourself never received. Freud would see this not as weakness, but as a deeply human attempt at healing. However, when this healing is outsourced to others, especially to one's children, it often results in disappointment and resentment. The true healing must happen inward. To begin that process, one must dare to sit with silence. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of presence, the kind that emerges when the external world no longer dictates your value. Freud believed the unconscious speaks most clearly when we are alone, undistracted. Retirement then becomes a sacred psychoanalytic space. Instead of rushing to fill every gap with activity or concern, perhaps it's time to listen. What memories rise? What emotions stir? What stories return, asking to be rewritten with a new perspective? In this new season of life, you are not just a former worker, a parent or a grandparent. You are a becoming, a soul in transformation, and this becoming requires you to let go of the illusion that your children are extensions of yourself. They are not your second chance. They are their own beings, navigating their own unconscious landscapes, facing their own shadows. Your role now is not to guide their path, but to walk your own with dignity and truth. This too, Freud would say, is love. And when you embody this love, not as need but as presence, your children will feel it. Perhaps not immediately, perhaps not with words, but the shift will ripple. They will sense that your energy has changed, from anxious to calm, from intrusive to available, from expectant to free. And in that freedom, something extraordinary can occur. The bond deepens, not through dependence, but through mutual respect. One of Freud's most profound contributions was his insight into the difference between love rooted in need and love rooted in desire. When we love because we need someone to complete us, that love becomes fragile, burdened, transactional. But when we love because we choose to, when we desire to offer presence without expectation, that love becomes expansive and enduring. Many parents unconsciously tether their worth to the responses of their children. But a love tied to reaction is always at the mercy of absence. A love tied to inner fullness cannot be shaken. In the stillness of retirement, when the world no longer demands constant performance, you are offered the most intimate stage of all, the one where you meet yourself. And in that meeting you may grieve, you may rage, you may feel foolish for having given so much without knowing how to keep anything for yourself. But that grief is sacred. Freud taught us that grief is not just about losing others, it is about the parts of ourselves we were never allowed to express. Retirement then is not a closing curtain, but a quiet spotlight on the self that waited backstage for decades. To step into that light requires bravery. It means risking discomfort, risking irrelevance, risking the unknown. But what waits on the other side is peace, the peace of no longer needing to be needed to feel worthy. The peace of offering love because it feels good to give, not because you fear disappearing. The peace of accepting that your children are not your life's final project, but part of its beautiful, complex mosaic. Freud never promised that self-awareness would bring immediate relief. In fact, he warned that it often brings more pain before it brings healing. But he also believed it was the only path to freedom, the only way to stop living in reaction and begin living in truth. And perhaps, as you read these words, some truth has already begun to stir inside you. A voice long silenced, a dream long buried, a desire long deferred. This is the moment to listen, because beyond the fear, beyond the worry, beyond the clinging and the grief, there is a self that is still unfolding. A self that is wise, vibrant, whole. And that self doesn't need to be called every day to know it is loved. It doesn't need to be included in every decision to feel worthy. It simply is. And from that place of being, you can offer your children something far more powerful than worry. You can offer the example of a life fully lived. In Freud's framework, we often find that the roots of over-attachment lie not in the present moment, but in unresolved psychic wounds from the past. The parent who hovers too closely in retirement is often not responding to their children's actual needs, but rather to an internalized anxiety, the fear of being forgotten, discarded, or irrelevant. These are not new fears. They are ancient, often rooted in the earliest relationships one had with their own caregivers. Now, in the absence of a career or social role, the psyche resurrects those buried fears and projects them onto adult children. It's not about them. It's about you. But awareness of this truth is not a condemnation. It's an invitation. Freud believed that nothing can truly be changed until it is first fully acknowledged. So if you recognize this in yourself, this subtle hunger for reassurance, this aching need to remain central, you are not broken. You are simply human. And this awareness is the beginning of transformation, because once the unconscious becomes conscious, it loses its power to control. You can begin to parent not from lack, but from fullness. Not to complete yourself, but to enjoy connection. This transition is not linear. There will be days when the silence feels heavy, when the phone doesn't ring, and the mind begins its old tricks. Did I do something wrong? Are they avoiding me? Do they still love me? These are the whispers of the inner child, not of the wise adult you are becoming. Freud taught that maturity means learning to sit with discomfort, to hear those whispers without obeying them, to recognize that your worth is not dependent on someone else's call or approval. It lives inside you. And from that internal sense of value comes a radical new way to relate. Instead of waiting for your children to remember you, you remember yourself. Instead of trying to be part of their every choice, you make your own. You begin to travel again, not just to places, but into forgotten corners of your own soul. You revive hobbies, passions, even friendships that were long buried under the weight of obligation. This is not selfishness. It is self-reclamation. And it is what Freud would call a return to the vitality of the ego. In time, something beautiful happens. Your children notice. They see you living, not waiting. They see you glowing, not begging. And in that shift, the entire dynamic changes. The guilt they may have carried evaporates. The resentment softens. Space opens for true connection, one not based on duty or pity, but on mutual admiration. You are no longer just mom or dad. You are a person again, a full, complex, and evolving being. And that, Freud would say, is the highest form of individuation. To understand the psychic cost of refusing to let go, Freud often turned to the idea of fixation. When an individual becomes fixated on a phase of life, they resist the natural progression of their development. A parent who refuses to release their children into full adulthood remains psychologically anchored in the parenting stage, unable to step into the rich, unexplored terrain of post-parental identity. Retirement, then, becomes a battleground, not of time, but of identity. And the real question becomes, are you willing to evolve, or will you cling to what has already passed? Clinging often appears noble. It wears the mask of love, responsibility, tradition. But beneath it lies fear. Fear of insignificance, fear of the void, fear of the self. Freud recognized this fear as a core component of neurosis, the avoidance of life's deeper truths through the repetition of familiar, safe behaviors. Worrying about your children becomes a distraction from asking, what do I want? What do I feel? What am I afraid to face? The moment you stop chasing their approval, you begin to uncover the answers to those more difficult, but more essential, questions. There is immense courage in doing this work. It means grieving the version of yourself that was once indispensable. It means accepting that your child no longer needs you to survive, and finding the beauty in that liberation. It means walking through the psychic fire of separation, not with bitterness but with reverence. For Freud, all growth is born of conflict, and this conflict between letting go and holding on, between past identity and present possibility, is precisely the tension that gives birth to your next evolution. In that evolution, you may find yourself surprised. You may rediscover joy in solitude, creativity in silence, meaning in spaces you never thought to explore. You may look in the mirror and see, for the first time in decades, not the parent of someone, but simply someone. That someone is worthy, not because of who they raised or what they gave, but because of who they are. Freud believed that this is the greatest freedom, to live not in reaction, but in authenticity, not for others, but from the truth of your own desire. And from this authenticity comes a new form of love. It is no longer urgent, anxious, or possessive. It is spacious, generous, and free. You begin to love your children not because you need to be needed, but because it brings you joy to witness them grow. You support from afar, bless from within, and stand firm in your own sacred ground. And that love, unattached to outcome, unburdened by ego, is the most powerful love of all. As the narrative unfolds, we must confront the painful illusion that often haunts retired parents, the belief that their value diminishes when they are no longer needed. Freud would dismantle this belief by exposing its roots in the ego's mistaken identification with function. You were never valuable because of what you did for others. You were always valuable because of who you are. But the mind, conditioned by decades of doing, forgets how to simply be. Retirement, then, is not a descent into irrelevance. It is an invitation to recover your essence. This recovery is a process, not an event. It begins with noticing the urge to intervene, the reflex to advise, the temptation to judge. These are not inherently wrong, but they are signs of attachment, not to your children, but to an outdated version of yourself. Freud would call this the residue of psychic investment. Your identity was once fused with their well-being. Now it is time to gently, lovingly separate, not to create distance, but to create freedom, both for you and for them. In that freedom, new energy begins to flow. Creative energy, spiritual energy, erotic energy, not in the narrow sexual sense, but in the Freudian sense of libido, the life force that animates desire, curiosity, passion. You start to feel alive again, not because someone needs you, but because you are exploring your own depths. The worry, once constant, begins to dissolve, not because the children have changed, but because you have. Your center has shifted inward. This shift does not mean abandoning your children. It means relating to them from a place of wholeness, not hunger. It means that your love is no longer a leash but a light, a presence that blesses without clinging, that supports without suffocating. And in that shift, relationships become less strained, more honest. You no longer say yes when you mean no. You no longer tolerate emotional dependence masked as closeness. You become, as Freud would say, psychically integrated. And perhaps most beautifully, you become a model, not just for your children, but for everyone watching you age with grace and courage. You teach, not through words, but through your presence, that it is possible to grow old without growing small. That life does not end when roles do, that the final chapters can be the most profound. And in that modeling, you give your children a gift no amount of worry could ever match. The gift of your own fulfilled becoming. To live without constantly worrying about your children is not to stop loving them. It is to start loving yourself in a more conscious way. Freud's work often illuminated how acts of overcare can become veiled forms of control, and how guilt can be passed down like an heirloom if we are not careful. By stepping back, by allowing your children to stumble, grow, and rise on their own terms, you are not failing them. You are giving them the space to become psychologically whole. That is not detachment, it is mature love. Yet many parents in retirement feel a haunting emptiness, as though letting go means vanishing. But that emptiness, as Freud would argue, is not a threat. It is a passage. The ego, stripped of external affirmations, begins to search inwardly for meaning. This is where the work begins. It's no longer about how others see you. It's about how you finally see yourself. The self that was buried under layers of sacrifice and silence. The self that once dreamed, created, yearned. That self still lives, waiting for your return. In this chapter, you no longer need to orchestrate anyone else's life. You no longer have to know what your children ate, who they're dating, or how they spend their money. These are not your responsibilities, they are their lives. Your life now is to find what still burns within you. Freud would say that psychic energy must be redirected to avoid stagnation. Worry is energy, so is longing, so is grief. And when these forces are no longer projected outward, they can be transformed into creation, discovery, joy. So imagine for a moment what it would feel like to wake up without guilt, to look at your phone and not feel anxious about whether it buzzed, to spend a day not thinking about what your children are doing, but about what you want to do. This is not selfishness. This is psychic liberation. You are not erasing them from your mind. You are simply stepping out of the emotional prison you built in their name. Freud would call this the reorganization of the psychic structure. A new foundation built not on need, but on self-knowledge. And when this reorganization takes root, you may be stunned by what follows. Your children, relieved of your emotional dependence, begin to approach you not out of guilt, but out of genuine connection. You become a lighthouse, not a tether, a place of wisdom, not worry. You become finally what Freud called a libidinally free being, someone whose love is no longer driven by fear, but by presence. And that, perhaps, is the truest legacy you can offer. In this final ascent of our narrative, let us return to the essence of Freud's deepest insight, that everything unresolved eventually returns, disguised. Retirement is not the end of your role, it is the return of your story. If you do not listen to what your soul is asking now, you will project that yearning onto those around you, especially your children. But if you dare to pause, to listen, to hold your own gaze in the mirror, something sacred occurs. You become whole, perhaps for the first time. You were not born to disappear into the background of someone else's life. You were born to evolve, to awaken, to express what only you can. Freud did not believe in the fantasy of a pain-free life, but he did believe in the possibility of a conscious one. A life where you are no longer dragged by old patterns, but guided by insight. A life where your relationships are no longer theaters of unmet needs, but sanctuaries of real presence. This is the promise of late-life individuation, not a retreat, but a radiant return. Imagine yourself, years from now, telling your story, not as the parent who worried every day, but as the soul who woke up, who learned to love without needing, who faced the silence and found poetry in it, who stopped searching for purpose in the faces of others and found it glowing in their own. That story is possible. It does not require your children to change. It only requires that you let go of the belief that their love determines your worth. And so you arrive at a threshold, not to a house filled with others, but to the quiet, dignified home of your own inner life. Freud would urge you to cross that threshold with courage, for what waits inside is not emptiness, but possibility. Possibility to reclaim your voice, possibility to forgive your past, possibility to redefine what joy looks like. Your best years may not be behind you. They may be the ones where you finally stop performing and start becoming. Because in the end, the greatest act of love you can offer, both to yourself and to your children, is to live with peace in your heart and clarity in your eyes. To release the need to be needed. To trust that love, when it is real, does not vanish with distance. It deepens in freedom. You are still here. You still matter. And now, perhaps more than ever, you are free to write the rest of your life from a place of truth. There comes a moment, somewhere between the silence of retirement and the echoes of the past, when the soul whispers what the mind tried so long to avoid. You are not your role. You are your essence. And that essence does not retire. It does not age. It only waits patiently for you to return to it. Everything you believed made you valuable, being needed, being present, being indispensable, was only ever a mirror. Now, without that reflection, you are finally free to see yourself not as a parent, not as a provider, but as a person who still breathes, still longs, still is. What Freud revealed to us is not how to live without pain, but how to live in truth. And truth is this: love that clings, fears, love that releases, liberates. In holding on too tightly to our children, we may unconsciously bind them and ourselves to expectations that were never theirs to carry. But when we step back, when we choose presence without possession, our love becomes an anchor in the best sense, not something that holds them down, but something that steadies us as they sail forward. Letting go is not forgetting. It is remembering differently. It is recognizing that the value of your life is not measured by how often someone calls or how many times they visit, but by the dignity with which you continue your own becoming. This is your season of redefinition, not disappearance. Your second act does not need an audience to be meaningful. It needs your authenticity. The same love that raised others now deserves to raise you, not for anyone else, but for the self that waited patiently behind the curtain of duty. So let me leave you with this. What if the greatest gift you can give your children now is your own fulfilled life? Not advice, not worry, not even presence, but the quiet, powerful example of a person who chose to live fully, deeply and honestly, even when the world stopped asking. Because when they see you thriving, not needing, they will not just admire you, they will learn from you. And perhaps that legacy will echo further than any word ever spoken. If this message reached somewhere deeper in you, if it reminded you of something you've forgotten about yourself, then let it not end here. Share this video with someone who may need it. Leave your thoughts below, not just as a comment, but as a piece of your own story. And if this journey resonated with you, I invite you to subscribe and walk with us in this community where every soul matters and every transformation is sacred. Because this isn't just a video, it's the beginning of something far greater.